Between 1923 and 1967, the Ashbridge Family Institute in Cleveland, Ohio, served as a rehabilitation center for troubled youth until investigators discovered what the children were really being rehabilitated for. The unmarked graves were found beneath the chapel floor during renovation work in 1968, each containing the remains of children between the ages of 8 and 16. What disturbed investigators most wasn't the number of bodies, 23 in total, but the surgical precision of the bone modifications found on each skeleton. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate, too ritualistic to be explained by any known medical procedure of the era. The Ashbridge Family Institute had operated for 44 years under the guise of Christian Reformation, taking in society's most vulnerable children with promises of salvation and structure. What they delivered instead was something far more sinister, something that would take investigators decades to piece together, and something that the surviving records suggest was never fully understood, even by those who participated in it. The institution's reputation. The Ashbridge Family Institute first opened its doors on October 12, 1923, in a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. The three-story building, originally constructed as a private estate in 1887, had been purchased by Reverend Charles Baker and his wife, Margaret Wells Baker, with funding from what they described as concerned Christian benefactors, whose names were never made public. The Institute's mission statement, printed in elegant script on letterhead that would become familiar to juvenile courts across Ohio, proclaimed their dedication to the moral reformation and spiritual guidance of wayward children through biblical instruction, manual labor, and family-style Christian living. Reverend Baker cut an impressive figure in Cleveland's religious community. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with prematurely gray hair and steel blue eyes, he commanded attention whenever he spoke at regional Methodist conferences. His credentials were impeccable: a graduate of Oberlin College's theology program, 10 years of missionary work in rural Kentucky, and a reputation for successfully turning around difficult children through what he called structured Christian intervention. Margaret Baker, a former schoolteacher from Pennsylvania, complimented her husband's stern demeanor with what observers described as maternal warmth and an uncanny ability to connect with traumatized children. The Institute's reputation grew steadily throughout the 1920s. Juvenile court judges from across northeastern Ohio began recommending the facility as an alternative to reform schools, particularly for children from broken homes or those who had committed minor offenses. The Ashbridge approach differed significantly from other institutions of the era. While most reform schools focused on punishment and containment, the Bakers emphasized what they termed family integration, placing each child within a structured household environment overseen by carefully selected house parents who lived on the grounds. By 1928, the Institute housed 43 children in 6 separate residential buildings that had been constructed on the property's expansive grounds. Each building named after biblical figures, Matthew House, Mark House, Luke House, John House, Ruth House, and Esther House, accommodated between 6 and 8 children under the supervision of a married couple who served as surrogate parents. The children attended classes in a converted barn that served as the schoolhouse, participated in daily chapel services in the mansion's main hall, and worked on the Institute's 160-acre farm, which provided both food for the community and income through the sale of dairy products and vegetables to Cleveland area groceries. What impressed visiting officials most was the apparent transformation they witnessed in the children. Court-appointed social workers reported that children who had arrived at Ashbridge as incorrigible delinquents became model citizens within months of their arrival. The transformation seemed particularly pronounced in children who had histories of violent behavior or sexual misconduct. Dr. Henry Wallace, a juvenile psychiatrist who served on Cleveland's Child Welfare Board from 1925 to 1943, wrote in his quarterly report that the Ashbridge methodology appears to address the root spiritual causes of juvenile delinquency in ways that purely secular approaches cannot match. The Institute's success attracted attention beyond Ohio's borders. By 1932, Children were being sent to Ashbridge from juvenile courts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and West Virginia. The facility expanded again, adding 3 more residential buildings and a workshop where older children learned trades such as carpentry, metalworking, and textile production. The products of their labor, furniture, tools, and clothing, were sold through a catalog distributed to churches across the Midwest, with proceeds supporting the Institute's operations. Reverend Baker's influence extended well beyond the Institute's grounds. He served on the board of the Ohio Council of Churches, chaired the Methodist Conference's Committee on Youth Services, and frequently testified before state legislative committees. Considering juvenile justice reform. His 1935 book, Reclaiming the Lost: A Christian Approach to Juvenile Rehabilitation, became required reading in several seminary programs and was translated into German and French for distribution in European religious communities. The Baker family themselves became symbols of Christian dedication and sacrifice. Charles and Margaret had no biological children, dedicating their lives entirely to the children in their care. They lived modestly in a small apartment within the main mansion, taking no salary beyond basic living expenses. Their personal sacrifice became part of the Institute's legend, frequently cited by supporters as evidence of their pure motives and spiritual calling. Letters from former residents, published in the Institute's annual reports throughout the 1930s and 1940s, painted a picture of lives transformed through Christian love and discipline. James Franklin, who spent 3 years at Ashbridge between 1929 and 1932, wrote in 1938, "The Bakers saved my life. I arrived as a thief and a liar, heading straight for prison or worse. They showed me that there was another way, a better way. I now have a wife, 2 children, and my own carpentry business. None of this would have been possible without the love and guidance I received at Ashbridge." Similar testimonials arrived regularly, describing successful marriages, stable employment, and active participation in local churches. The Institute's success rate, measured by the percentage of former residents who avoided future legal troubles, consistently exceeded 90%, a figure that impressed even skeptical observers within the juvenile justice system. The physical appearance of the Institute reinforced its reputation for wholesome Christian living. The grounds were meticulously maintained, with flower gardens, vegetable plots, and pastures where dairy cows grazed peacefully. Visitors often commented on the cleanliness of the buildings, the politeness of the children, and the obvious affection between the house parents and their charges. The chapel, converted from the mansion's original ballroom, featured beautiful stained glass windows donated by supporting churches and could accommodate the entire Institute community for daily services. What visitors couldn't see, however, were the modifications made to the mansion's basement levels. The original wine cellar had been expanded and divided into multiple rooms, ostensibly for storage and mechanical systems. Access to these areas was restricted to senior staff members, and the heavy wooden doors were kept locked at all times. When asked about the basement facilities during official inspections, Reverend Baker explained that they contained sensitive records, valuable supplies, and equipment that required secure storage. The Institute's financial records, while never made fully public, suggested a level of prosperity that exceeded what could be reasonably expected from their known revenue sources. The farm operation and workshop sales generated modest income, and donations from supporting churches provided additional funding. But the Institute's expansion and improvements implied access to substantial capital that was never adequately explained. When questioned about their financial backing, the Bakers consistently referred to their anonymous benefactors, who preferred to remain unnamed out of Christian humility. The children themselves seemed to confirm the Institute's success. When interviewed by social workers during routine visits, they spoke positively about their experiences, their house parents, and their education. They appeared healthy, well-fed, and appropriately dressed. Their academic progress, while difficult to measure due to the Institute's non-traditional educational approach, seemed adequate for children from their backgrounds. Most importantly, they expressed no desire to leave before completing their assigned rehabilitation periods, which typically lasted between 2 and 4 years. What state inspectors and visiting officials didn't realize was that they were only seeing what the Bakers wanted them to see. The scheduled visits followed predictable patterns, and the children who interacted with outsiders were carefully selected and prepared. The true nature of life at the Ashbridge Family Institute remained hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of Christian charity and successful rehabilitation, a facade that would not begin to crack until the late 1950s, when a few former residents began to speak about experiences that differed dramatically from the official narrative. By 1940, the Ashbridge Family Institute had become a model for Christian-based juvenile rehabilitation throughout the United States. Delegations from other states visited regularly to study their methods, and Reverend Baker was invited to speak at conferences across the country. The Institute's reputation was so solid that juvenile court judges rarely questioned their recommendations, and state inspection reports consistently praised their facilities and methods. The children themselves seemed to confirm the Institute's success. When interviewed by social workers during routine visits, they spoke positively about their experiences, their house parents, and their education. They appeared healthy, well-fed, and appropriately dressed. Their academic progress, while difficult to measure due to the Institute's non-traditional educational approach, seemed adequate for children from their backgrounds. Most importantly, they expressed no desire to leave before completing their assigned rehabilitation periods, which typically lasted between 2 and 4 years. What state inspectors and visiting officials didn't realize was that they were only seeing what the Bakers wanted them to see. The scheduled visits followed predictable patterns, and the children who interacted with outsiders were carefully selected and prepared. The true nature of life at the Ashbridge Family Institute remained hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of Christian charity and successful rehabilitation, a facade that would not begin to crack until the late 1950s, when a few former residents began to speak about experiences that differed dramatically from the official narrative. Hidden beneath this success story was a system of carefully orchestrated deception that would allow the Institute's true activities to undetected for more than 40 years. Ignored signs. The first documented concern about the Ashbridge Family Institute appeared in a routine inspection report filed by Ohio State social worker Dorothy Hughes in March 1939. Hughes noted what she described as an unusual degree of uniformity in the children's responses to questions about their daily activities and future plans. She observed that while the children appeared healthy and well cared for, their answers to her interview questions seemed rehearsed and lacked the individual personality traits she typically encountered in institutional settings. Hughes' report also mentioned her inability to inspect certain areas of the facility. When she requested access to the basement storage areas, Reverend Baker explained that the spaces contained confidential records and were not part of the residential facilities requiring inspection. While this explanation was technically acceptable under state regulations, Hughes noted that the locked basement doors seemed unusually heavy and that she could hear what sounded like mechanical equipment running behind them, despite being told the spaces were used only for storage. More troubling was Hughes's observation about the children's physical appearance. While all appeared healthy and well-nourished, she noted that several showed signs of what she described as minor surgical scarring on their hands and forearms. When she inquired about these marks, the house parents explained that the children were learning various trades and that small cuts and burns were common in workshop environments. However, Hughes noted that the scars appeared too uniform and healed too cleanly to be consistent with typical workplace injuries. Hughes' concerns were dismissed by her supervisor, Robert Anderson, who had visited Ashbridge on multiple occasions and considered it one of Ohio's most successful rehabilitation facilities. Anderson noted that Hughes was relatively new to institutional inspections and might be overanalyzing normal variations in institutional life. The report was filed without further investigation, and Hughes was reassigned to other facilities. The pattern of dismissed concerns continued throughout the 1940s. In 1942, Dr. Edward Collins, a pediatrician who provided medical services to several state institutions, noted unusually high rates of minor surgical procedures among Ashbridge residents. His record showed that children at the institute required treatment for small cuts, puncture wounds, and what he described as unexplained tissue damage, at rates significantly higher than other facilities he served. When he questioned Reverend Baker about this pattern, he was told that the institute's emphasis on manual labor and farming naturally resulted in more injuries than facilities focused on academic education. Dr. Collins also observed that children from Ashbridge seemed unusually reluctant to discuss their injuries. While most children were eager to tell dramatic stories about their accidents, Ashbridge residents typically provided minimal, identical explanations. They had been careless, they were learning to be more careful, and their house parents were helping them become more responsible. The uniformity of these responses troubled Dr. Collins, but when he raised his concerns with state officials, he was reminded that the Institute's success rate in rehabilitation was exemplary, and that his medical role should focus on treating injuries rather than questioning institutional methods. More serious concerns began to emerge in 1945 when Anna Gilbert, a former house parent at Ruth House, contacted the Cleveland Police Department with allegations about her experiences at the Institute. Gilbert, who had worked at Ashbridge for 18 months before leaving in 1944, claimed that children were subjected to what she described as ritualistic punishments that went far beyond normal disciplinary measures. According to Gilbert's statement, children who violated institute rules were taken to basement rooms where they underwent procedures she was not allowed to witness, but which left them subdued and fearful for weeks. Afterward, Gilbert's allegations were investigated by Detective George Mitchell, who visited the institute in September 1945. Mitchell found the facility to be well maintained and the children to be respectful and apparently content. When he interviewed several children privately about their experiences, they consistently denied any mistreatment and praised their house parents and the Baker family. Mitchell noted that the children seemed remarkably mature and self-controlled for their ages, but found no evidence to support Gilbert's allegations. Reverend Baker provided Mitchell with personnel records showing that Gilbert had been dismissed from her position due to inappropriate disciplinary methods and difficulty maintaining proper boundaries with the children in her care. The record suggested that Gilbert's accusations might be motivated by resentment over her termination. Mitchell's report concluded that Gilbert's allegations were unsubstantiated and possibly motivated by personal grievances. The most significant warning sign came in 1948 when Marie Douglas, a 15-year-old resident of Esther House, attempted to escape from the institute. Douglas was found 3 days later in downtown Cleveland, severely dehydrated and suffering from what hospital records described as multiple small puncture wounds on her arms and torso. When questioned by police, Douglas initially claimed that she had been hurt during the lessons, but later recanted, saying she had injured herself while hiding in the woods during her escape attempt. Douglas was returned to the institute, where she remained until her 18th birthday in 1951. According to her case file, she completed her rehabilitation successfully and was released with positive recommendations for employment and housing assistance. However, Douglas disappeared from all official records after her release. Attempts by social workers to conduct follow-up interviews found no trace of her, despite the Institute's policy of maintaining contact with former residents to document their continued success. The pattern of missing former residents became more apparent as the 1950s progressed. While the Institute continued to publish success stories in their annual reports, independent attempts to verify these accounts often came up empty. Of the 43 former residents who should have been available for interviews between 1950 and 1955, state social workers were able to locate only 16. The others had seemingly vanished, leaving no forwarding addresses, employment records, or contact information with family members. Frances Lowe, a social worker assigned to conduct follow-up studies in 1954, noted this pattern in a confidential memo to her supervisor. Lowe pointed out that the Institute's claimed success rate was impossible to verify without access to the missing former residents. She recommended a more thorough investigation of the Institute's record-keeping practices and suggested that the state require more rigorous documentation of residents' post-release activities. Lowe's recommendations were rejected by her supervisor, Joseph Carter, who argued that the Institute's reputation and the positive testimonials from located former residents provided sufficient evidence of their effectiveness. Carter noted that many young adults from troubled backgrounds naturally became transient, and that the missing former residents had probably simply moved to other states or changed their names to escape their past. Associations with the juvenile justice system. The most disturbing incident occurred in 1956 when construction workers renovating a drainage system on the Institute's property discovered what appeared to be bone fragments in the soil. The fragments were examined by Dr. Frank Reynolds, the county coroner, who determined they were from small animals, probably pets that had been buried on the grounds over the years. However, several workers reported that the fragments appeared to be arranged in deliberate patterns, rather than scattered randomly as would be expected from normal burials. When questioned about the bone fragments, Reverend Baker explained that the Institute maintained a small cemetery for farm animals and pets that had died over the years. He provided maps showing the locations of known animal graves and suggested that the construction had probably disturbed these burial sites. The explanation satisfied official inquiries, and construction continued without further investigation. By 1957, the Ashbridge Family Institute had operated for 34 years with minimal outside interference, despite a growing pattern of unexplained incidents and concerning observations. The Institute's reputation for success, combined with the influential positions held by Reverend Baker within Ohio's religious and political communities, seemed to insulate it from serious scrutiny. State officials, juvenile court judges, and social workers continued to regard Ashbridge as a model institution, and referrals continued to arrive regularly. What none of these officials realized was that their trust in the Institute's methods was enabling something far more sinister than ineffective rehabilitation practices. The signs they had dismissed as minor administrative issues or isolated incidents were actually pieces of a larger pattern of systematic abuse that would only become fully apparent a decade later, when survivors finally found the courage to speak about experiences that had been too traumatic and too unbelievable to discuss earlier. The ignored warnings of the 1940s and 1950s would later be recognized as missed opportunities to save dozens of children from experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. By the time the full scope of the Institute's activities became known, it would be too late for many of the children who had tried, in their own limited ways, to signal for help. Horror uncovered. The first crack in the Ashbridge Family Institute's carefully maintained facade appeared on November 15, 1963, when Raymond Elliott, a former resident who had spent 4 years at the facility between 1951 and 1955, walked into the offices of the Cleveland Plain dealer with a story that would begin to unravel 40 years of hidden atrocities. Elliott, now 26 and working as a mechanic in Detroit, had driven 5 hours to Cleveland with a manila folder containing what he claimed were proof that the Bakers were doing things to children that nobody would believe. Elliott's folder contained 14 hand-drawn maps showing the layout of the Institute's basement levels, detailed descriptions of rooms and equipment that were not included in any official building plans, and a list of 37 names of children who he claimed had disappeared during his time at the facility. Most disturbing were his sketches of what he described as the preparation rooms and the ceremony chambers, spaces where he alleged children were subjected to ritualistic procedures that combined elements of medical experimentation with what he could only describe as religious madness. According to Elliott's account, the basement areas beneath the main mansion contained at least 12 rooms that were used for what the staff called advanced rehabilitation sessions. These sessions, Elliott claimed, were presented to selected children as special opportunities to participate in sacred ceremonies that would complete their spiritual transformation. Children chosen for these sessions were told they were being honored for their progress and spiritual development, making them feel special and chosen rather than fearful. The sessions, Elliott alleged, began with what appeared to be religious ceremonies conducted by Reverend Baker and other senior staff members. Children were brought to elaborately decorated basement chambers where they participated in prayers, hymns, and rituals that seemed to combine Christian elements with practices that Elliot could not identify. The children were given special foods and drinks that made them feel drowsy and compliant, after which they were subjected to procedures that Elliot described as part surgery, part torture, part something else entirely. Elliot's most specific allegations concerned what he called the marking rituals. According to his account, children were subjected to precise cuts and punctures on their arms, legs, and torso using instruments that appeared to be custom-made for the purpose. The cuts were made in specific patterns that varied depending on the child's spiritual status and rehabilitation progress. The procedures were conducted with medical precision, using proper sterilization and bandaging techniques, but the purposes were clearly non-medical. Even more disturbing were Elliot's claims about what happened to children who completed the full ceremony cycle. According to his account, children who participated in multiple marking rituals over several months eventually underwent what the staff called final preparation. Elliot claimed that these children were taken to deeper basement rooms that he was never allowed to see, and that they were never seen again by other residents. When children asked about their missing friends, they were told that these children had graduated to a higher level of service and had been transferred to special placements where they could use their spiritual training to help other troubled children. The plain dealer initially struggled with how to handle Elliot's allegations. The claims seemed too extreme to be credible, yet Elliot appeared sincere, and his detailed knowledge of the Institute's layout and personnel suggested genuine insider knowledge. After 3 weeks of investigation, reporter Albert Fisher was assigned to verify what aspects of Elliot's story could be independently confirmed. Fisher's investigation immediately encountered obstacles. Current and former staff members at the Institute refused to speak with him, citing confidentiality agreements and loyalty to the Baker family. State officials who had conducted inspections over the years insisted that they had never observed anything inappropriate and suggested that Elliot might be suffering from mental health issues related to his troubled childhood. Even former residents who had been successfully located by social workers in previous years seemed reluctant to discuss their experiences, typically insisting that their time at Ashbridge had been positive and transformative. However, Fisher was able to confirm several troubling aspects of Elliot's account. Building permits filed with the county showed that extensive basement renovations had been conducted at the Institute between 1925 and 1928, but the plans for these renovations had been filed under a religious exemption that prevented them from being subject to normal inspection requirements. Medical supply companies confirmed that the Institute had purchased unusual quantities of surgical instruments, anesthetics, and specialized tools that seemed inconsistent with the basic first aid needs of a juvenile facility. Most significantly, Fisher was able to confirm Elliot's claims about missing former residents. Of the 847 children who had been released from the Institute between 1923 and 1963, Fisher could locate only 312 through normal investigative methods. The missing 535 individuals had left no traceable records of employment, marriage, military service, or interaction with any other institutions. For a population that should have been easily trackable through various government and social service databases, the complete disappearance of more than half the Institute's former residents was statistically impossible under normal circumstances. Fisher's investigation was interrupted on January 8, 1964, when a fire destroyed the Institute's main administrative building, including all paper records dating back to the facility's founding. The fire was attributed to an electrical malfunction in the building's aging wiring system, but investigators noted that the blaze had burned with unusual intensity and had completely consumed materials that should have been partially recoverable. The timing of the fire, occurring just weeks after Fisher's investigation had begun, raised suspicions but could not be proven to be anything other than coincidental. The destruction of the Institute's records might have ended the investigation, but Elliot's allegations had attracted the attention of other former residents who had remained silent for decades. Over the following months, 6 additional former residents contacted the plain dealer with corroborating accounts of basement ceremonies, marking rituals, and missing children. Their stories, while varying in specific details, contained enough common elements to suggest a consistent pattern of abuse. The most compelling testimony came from Carl Bennett, who had been a resident at the Institute from 1947 to 1950. Bennett, now 34 and living in Chicago, provided investigators with a detailed account of what he called graduation ceremonies conducted in basement chambers. According to Bennett's testimony, children who had undergone multiple marking sessions were eventually selected for special ceremonies that were presented as the culmination of their spiritual rehabilitation. Bennett described elaborate rituals conducted by Reverend Baker and other senior staff members, during which selected children were subjected to increasingly invasive procedures that combined religious symbolism with what appeared to be medical experimentation. The children were told that they were participating in sacred ceremonies that would allow them to serve God in special ways, and that their willingness to endure these procedures demonstrated their complete spiritual transformation. The most horrifying aspect of Bennett's testimony concerned what happened during the final ceremonies. According to his account, children who participated in these ultimate rituals were subjected to procedures that were clearly intended to be fatal. Bennett claimed that he had witnessed at least 3 such ceremonies during his time at the Institute, and that the children who participated were buried in unmarked graves on the Institute's property after elaborate funeral services that were presented to other residents as celebrations of their graduation to eternal service. Bennett's allegations were corroborated by physical evidence discovered during a covert investigation conducted by private investigators hired by the plain dealer. Using ground-penetrating radar, investigators identified at least 23 burial sites on the Institute's property that were not consistent with the official animal cemetery described by Reverend Baker. The burial sites were arranged in precise geometric patterns and were located in areas of the property that had been off-limits to residents and most staff members. The investigation reached a turning point in March 1965 when Eugene Hoffman, a former maintenance worker at the Institute, provided investigators with a set of keys that he claimed provided access to the basement areas described by Elliott and other former residents. Hoffman, who had worked at the facility from 1958 to 1962, claimed that he had discovered the true purpose of the basement rooms by accident and had been forced to sign a confidentiality agreement that prevented him from discussing his observations. Using Hoffman's keys, investigators conducted a nighttime exploration of the Institute's basement areas and discovered chambers that matched the descriptions provided by former residents. The rooms contained medical equipment, surgical instruments, and ceremonial objects that clearly indicated uses far beyond normal institutional operations. Most disturbing were the stone altars, elaborate carved symbols, and drainage systems that suggested the rooms had been designed specifically for the ritualistic procedures described by survivors. Photographs and evidence collected during this covert investigation provided the documentation needed to support formal criminal charges. On July 12, 1965, Ohio State Police executed search warrants at the Ashbridge Family Institute and arrested Reverend Charles Baker, Margaret Baker, and 7 senior staff members on charges of murder, child abuse, and conspiracy. The arrests marked the beginning of what would become one of the most shocking criminal cases in Ohio's history, as investigators worked to uncover the full scope of activities that had been conducted at the facility for more than 40 years. Legacy and silence. The trial of Charles Baker and his associates began on October 3, 1966, in Cleveland Municipal Court, but it would never reach a conclusion that satisfied anyone seeking justice or answers. Within days of the proceedings beginning, it became apparent that powerful forces were working to limit the scope of the investigation and prevent the full truth about the Ashbridge Family Institute from becoming public knowledge. The first indication of interference came when key pieces of evidence mysteriously disappeared from police custody. The photographs taken during the covert basement investigation vanished from the evidence room, along with several of the ceremonial objects that had been seized during the official search warrants. The investigating officers claimed that the items had been misfiled during the transfer to the prosecutor's office, but they were never recovered despite extensive searches. More troubling was the systematic intimidation of witnesses who had agreed to testify about their experiences at the Institute. Raymond Elliott, whose initial testimony had launched the investigation, was found dead in his Detroit apartment on November 15, 1966, exactly 3 years after he had first contacted the Cleveland plain dealer. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by drug overdose, but friends and family members insisted that Elliott had shown no signs of depression or drug use and that he had been looking forward to his testimony as an opportunity to finally seek justice for the children who had suffered at Ashbridge. Carl Bennett, the second key witness, survived an apparent assassination attempt on December 3, 1966, when his car's brakes failed while he was driving to the courthouse to provide testimony. Bennett suffered serious injuries but survived the crash, after which he immediately recanted his previous statements and refused to cooperate further with the investigation. When contacted by reporters, Bennett claimed that his earlier testimony had been fabricated and that he had been pressured by investigators to make false accusations against the Baker family. The pattern of witness intimidation extended to other former residents who had provided corroborating testimony. Within 6 months of the trial beginning, 4 additional witnesses had either died under suspicious circumstances or had recanted their previous statements. The few survivors who maintained their willingness to testify found themselves facing criminal charges for unrelated offenses, effectively preventing their testimony from being heard in court. The legal case against the Bakers was further undermined by the intervention of influential religious and political figures who vouched for their character and questioned the credibility of the accusations. Letters of support arrived from governors, congressmen, religious leaders, and prominent business figures, all attesting to the Bakers' reputation for Christian service and their positive impact on thousands of children over 4 decades of operation. Most significantly, the investigation revealed connections between the Ashbridge Family Institute and powerful individuals who had strong motivations to prevent the full truth from becoming public. Financial records, recovered from sources outside the Institute, showed that the facility had received substantial funding from wealthy benefactors who were prominent members of Ohio's political and business establishment. These benefactors, who had maintained their anonymity throughout the Institute's operation, suddenly found themselves potentially implicated in decades of criminal activity if the full scope of the Institute's operations became public knowledge. The pressure to contain the scandal reached its peak in March 1967 when federal authorities intervened in the case, claiming jurisdiction based on allegations that the Institute had been involved in interstate trafficking of children. The federal investigation, led by agents whose names were never made public, concluded that while inappropriate disciplinary methods may have been employed at the facility, there was insufficient evidence to support charges of murder or ritualistic abuse. The federal report, released in May 1967, attributed the allegations against the Bakers to a combination of false memory syndrome, suggestion-induced testimony, and deliberate fabrication by mentally unstable former residents seeking financial compensation. The report acknowledged that some children had died while in residence at the Institute, but attributed these deaths to medical conditions, accidents, and suicides that were consistent with the challenging population served by the facility. Charles Baker, who had maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, died of an apparent heart attack on June 15, 1967, just 3 days before he was scheduled to provide testimony in his own defense. Margaret Baker was found dead in her cell on July 4, 1967, having apparently taken her own life, using medications that investigators could never determine how she had obtained. With the deaths of the primary defendants, the remaining charges against staff members were quietly dropped, and the official investigation was closed. The Ashbridge Family Institute ceased operations on August 1, 1967, with the remaining children being transferred to other facilities throughout Ohio. The property was sold to a private development company with connections to several of the Institute's original anonymous benefactors. The buildings were demolished within 6 months, and the land was converted into an upscale residential subdivision called Ashbridge Estates, with no acknowledgement of the property's previous use. The unmarked graves discovered during the investigation were quietly relocated to an undisclosed location, officially described as a consecrated cemetery where the remains could be properly interred with appropriate religious ceremonies. The families of the deceased children were never notified of these relocations, and no public records were maintained of the new burial site. Requests for information about the location of these graves have been consistently denied by Ohio state authorities, who cite privacy concerns and ongoing legal considerations. The surviving former residents of the Institute found themselves facing a wall of official silence and public skepticism that effectively prevented them from seeking any form of justice or acknowledgement. Those who attempted to pursue civil litigation found their cases dismissed on technical grounds or delayed indefinitely through procedural maneuvers. Support groups for survivors were infiltrated and disrupted by individuals who encouraged members to move on and focus on the positive aspects of their rehabilitation experience. Most troubling was the systematic erasure of documentation related to the Institute's operations. State records, court files, and even newspaper coverage of the investigation began disappearing from official archives. Libraries reported that relevant materials were being stolen or vandalized, making it increasingly difficult for researchers or journalists to reconstruct the full story of what had occurred at Ashbridge. The few journalists who attempted to investigating the case found themselves facing legal threats, loss of employment, and other forms of professional retaliation. Albert Fisher, the plain dealer reporter who had conducted the initial investigation, was transferred to the sports department and eventually left journalism entirely. Other reporters who showed interest in the story were warned off by editors who cited concerns about unsubstantiated allegations and potential liability issues. By 1970, the Ashbridge Family Institute had been effectively erased from public memory. The official records that remained portrayed it as a well-intentioned but ultimately failed experiment in Christian-based juvenile rehabilitation that had been closed due to administrative irregularities and changing approaches to youth services. The allegations of ritualistic abuse and murder were dismissed as urban legends and conspiracy theories promoted by disturbed individuals seeking attention or financial gain. The surviving victims of the Institute's abuse found themselves isolated and unable to obtain recognition or support for their traumatic experiences. Many struggled with substance abuse, mental health issues, and difficulties maintaining stable relationships or employment. The precise nature of what they had experienced remained so disturbing and unbelievable that even mental health professionals often questioned their accounts or attributed their symptoms to other causes. Today, more than 50 years after the Institute's closure, the full truth about what occurred within its walls remains buried beneath layers of official secrecy and deliberate obfuscation. The unmarked graves have never been found, the missing children have never been accounted for, and the powerful individuals who enabled and protected the Institute's operations have never been held accountable. The Ashbridge Estates subdivision now occupies the site where the Institute once stood, with expensive homes housing families who have no knowledge of the property's dark history. The basement chambers where children were tortured and killed have been filled with concrete and built over, but the evil that once flourished there has left a mark that sensitive individuals claim can still be felt. The few surviving former residents to seek acknowledgement and justice, but their efforts are hampered by advanced age, health problems, and the systematic destruction of evidence that might support their claims. Their testimony, dismissed as unreliable by official investigations, remains the only record of experiences that were too horrific to be believed and too well protected to be prosecuted. The legacy of the Ashbridge Family Institute serves as a reminder of how institutional authority, religious respectability, and political influence can be used to conceal unspeakable crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. The children who suffered and died within its walls have been denied even the basic recognition of their humanity, reduced to statistics in sanitized reports that obscure rather than illuminate the truth of their experiences. The silence that surrounds the Institute's true history is not accidental but deliberate, maintained by individuals and institutions that have powerful reasons to ensure that certain truths never become public knowledge. That silence continues to protect the perpetrators and their enablers, while condemning the victims to a form of death that extends beyond the grave, the death of memory, acknowledgement, and justice. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.